educating, placing, and supporting young people on boards of directors. So while our work isn't specific to any one industry, it actually started with a project called Harvard Forward, which brought together Harvard alumni, students, faculty, staff, and to place 5 recent alumni onto Harvard's Board of Overseers with a platform that called for the university to divest from fossil fuels, double down on climate-focused research and education, and reserve 6 out of its 30 Board of Overseers seats for recent alumni that had graduated within the past 5 years. Since then, Harvard Forward's sister campaign, Yale Forward, has placed a young climate policy expert on the Yale Corporation's 2021 ballot with a similar climate action, endowment justice, and inclusive governance platform. So obviously, having a handful of young people on these boards doesn't guarantee that a university will take bold climate action, but we have an inkling that one of the many reasons universities might be out of step with the young people that they're meant to serve is because their governance structures are excluding necessary perspectives. But the nice thing is we don't have to look very far to explore that reasoning, which is why we teamed up with the Intentional Endowments Network to talk to a few former students who had served in their university governance structures, taking on big climate-related issues. For those of you who aren't really familiar with student trustee positions or young trustee positions at other universities across the country, over 70% of public colleges and university boards of trustees include at least one undergraduate student trustee, according to a 2010 study by the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. That number, of course, shines pretty bright compared to the 20% of private institutions with undergraduate student trustees, and only 9% of them that have student trustees who can actually vote on their board of trustees. So I'm excited today to talk with Alexis, Michael, and Dustin, who have served in roles in and beyond some of these statistics. We'll let the panelists introduce themselves again in a second, but just to give you a primer on each of them, where they're coming from in this conversation. Dustin is a current master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, studying higher education. He's a recent graduate of Cornell University, where he served as a student-elected trustee on Cornell's Board of Trustees in the 2 years leading up to the board's decision to divest in 2020. During his time on the board, he focused his efforts on improving the student experience and fostering dialogue between students and university stakeholders. Michael is a 2019 graduate of the University of North Carolina at Asheville, where he earned a degree in accounting and business management and served both as the student body president and representative on the university and its foundation's board of trustees. As a student trustee, he worked to voice a human weight to complex issues with real implications, focusing on relational avenues of trusteeship. The university's board decided to divest in June 2019, and he now works as a business partner at SAP SuccessFactors. Alexis Gilchrist graduated magna cum laude from the University of New Hampshire's Peter T. Paul College of Business and Economics in 2018. At UNH, Alexis served as a member of the Executive Advisory Board at the Peter T. Paul College of Business and Economics and the Committee on Investor Responsibility. Upon graduation, she joined the deals team at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Boston. With that said, I'll hand it back off to Hannah to talk a little bit more about some university boards and their progress on climate action and what it is that boards who champion environmental, social, and governance practices do well. So handing off to you, Hannah.
Awesome, thanks, Julia. And really so excited to hear from Dustin and Michael and Alexis on this call and really learn from you all. And from all of you who are joining, know there's a wealth of experience I can see around the tiles and in the chat coming from a lot of different schools. So I'm going to pull up just a few slides, not going to overwhelm folks with information, hopefully, but just to kind of do a quick standard setting of where things are at and share a little bit more about what IEN is doing. And just a little context on me. I work at the Intentional Endowments Network. I went to Yale for undergrad and did a master's program at Harvard. And those are two universities that I am thrilled have been targets for expanded young leadership on the boards and more sort of transparency and climate action as key priorities for those young leaders. through the Harvard Forward and Yale that the boarding school is supporting. And so thrilled that those candidates have been doing so well in starting to lead on boards of institutions that I care about, but have also been disappointed by it in some ways. So have a personal connection to this work. And then in my day job, I'm trying to support endowments across the country and even some endowments outside of the US to advance this work. So IEN is a peer learning network. And what that means is, we bring stakeholders together who don't always see each other as peers, but really can build this whole field of sustainable investing, better governance of institutions, and really, seeing institutions, particularly higher education institutions, as key actors in many different ways, as investors, as educators, as leaders in our communities. And so, we have a vision of all of these institutions being responsible actors in those ways, and really focus in on how we can make that happen. So the slide that's up now is just a very large hodgepodge of the different ways that we do that. We are focused in on two main themes that all of the institutions that we work with have somewhere in their own mission, somewhere in their own reason for being and the reason they exist as higher ed institutions, some commitment to building the society that we want. So we're focused on the social equity and climate and environmental goals that we want to see in the world, and that these institutions have said they want to see in the world as well. And there are lots of different ways to advance those goals, and we're focused on the financial side of things. So that means endowments themselves, these large pools of money that are invested to get returns that fund really important campus activities, but the way in which they make those returns sometimes overshadows the returns themselves and the impact they can have. We're also working with retirement funds at these institutions. So if you're a faculty member, you want your retirement fund to align with the same things that brought you to the job, right? And so having investment options for faculty and staff at all of these institutions that align with their goals. And then with all of you. So what we label in our work plans as the next generation of sustainable investors, but in some cases are very much the current generation of sustainable investors. And I'll talk in just a second about the student managed fund network that is a key element of that work. And the peer learning activities themselves involve a lot of things like this. So a lot of webinars and previously a lot of in-person meetings, and really built on that principle that, to make change, we have to build trust, we have to listen to each other, we have to learn together. And so what our members have created is a set of resources that follow this pathway that's on the screen now. We call it our roadmap, but just acknowledging that governance boards, leaders in all of these institutions have typically traveled a path that looks like this, where from whatever point they're starting, there is a learning process about what is possible and what is currently happening. And I think probably many of you on the call are, at some point in that learning process. And then there's a consensus building process. So once everyone has some information about, for example, what's currently in the endowment's portfolio and the harm it may be causing or the solutions it may be generating, what do we want it to look like? And once we know what's out there, how do we, set a set of goals that everybody can get behind? And then the rest of the roadmap is really putting that into practice. And we'll hear a lot more about that today, how different institutions are putting new policies in place and then actually implementing them and shifting where their money is going and what it is supporting and what it is not supporting. And so, all of our work is kind of organized around moving more and more institutions through this process. and recognizing that it's a constant iteration. So what seems possible today is going to be commonplace tomorrow, and something new is going to seem possible. And so there is that kind of constant improvement and constant learning. Where things stand right now is great. There's progress, and there's a lot more work to be done as well. So a couple of slides that I will add here all have some links at the bottom, and we can share these slides after the presentation as well, if you want to learn more about kind of the state of sustainable investing overall and at endowments in particular. But we've seen, you know, a lot of movement and a lot of shifting of dollars into environmental, social, and governance informed investment strategies. Lots of different terms for that and lots of different definitions for that. So the size of the market here listed as $17 trillion in the US really depends on how you count it. And so a lot of the work that I know you all are doing and that needs to be done is around constantly making those definitions clearer and better and more targeted for what we actually want to see, and not just greenwashing or sort of labeling something as environmentally friendly or climate positive when it's, you know, actually not making that much of a difference. But, you know, a lot of that shift towards moving investment in the direction of ESG is driven by the push for climate action. And so in recent surveys, we've seen educational institutions in particular really prioritizing climate in that big bucket of category of ESG investing. And we rely a lot on the National Association of College and University Business Officers. And so kind of the trade group of business officers at all of your schools. And they survey endowment stakeholders regularly and ask, okay, what are you really doing? And, you know, not everyone responds, but 800 or so institutions do provide data on where they're investing, what their returns are for those investments, and what they're factoring into their investment process. And, you know, depending on how you slice the data, you get some different conclusions. So about a third have a sustainable investing policy or some sort of sustainable investing principle being applied to their investments, but only 16% had actually made investments in, you know, a specific ESG or socially responsible product that they were able to report in this survey. So it really depends, you know, who you're asking and how you're gathering the information, how much progress it seems like we have made. So we do additional tracking as a network with our own members and with schools who are more transparent. And I think we'll probably hear more throughout the hour about the lack of transparency being a big barrier to change. But that, you know, we're pushing for that. And as we get more information, it helps others, other schools to feel comfortable opening up about what they're doing. And so we look at some very concrete things, like has the investment committee made an investment policy statement? And apologies for all of the acronyms on this slide, but IPS as the investment policy statement is really where a school is saying, like, this is where we want our money to go in those pretty general terms. 69 schools have signed on to a firm commitment. That's something that students can then hold them to, right? So we're pushing for more endowments to put those statements out there, make those concrete commitments. Many have established committees on investor responsibility, and we'll hear from a member of one today, and those take different forms, have different levels of power and influence, but we consider a really great best practice for incorporating sustainable investing practices. And the big one that I think gets a lot of press and has driven a lot of attention is around fossil fuel divestment as a very concrete ask. Hasn't been the right choice or right fit for every kind of institution, but you know, those numbers are growing. And even institutions that have decided divestment is not the right fit for their investment strategy have felt the pressure to justify what their investment strategy is and what other either engaging with companies or incorporating other kinds of factors into their investment process to reduce their exposure to fossil fuels. They've at least felt that need to speak to it. So I'm going to kind of end there and hand off to examples from our speakers, but we'll just show, we have a number of case studies that we produce as a network to show what's happening in kind of the best leading edge of the field. Arizona State, Becker College, University of California, Warren Wilson College. These sum up kind of different aspects of what we see as that cutting edge, whether it's in shareholder engagement and the companies they already own, or it's in making divestment commitments, or it's incorporating ESG strategies throughout their portfolio. It's happening, and there are boards that support this, and there are chief investment officers who are implementing it. Not as many as we would like so far, but there are these examples that you can point stakeholders at your school to. And, as I said, we're all about bringing people together. That includes students, and, recognizing that none of the endowment stakeholders are acting in a vacuum. And however we can build connections between the administrations and the governance structures of universities and colleges and the student body and faculty, the more those things are all connected, the more the institutions will reflect the stakeholders they serve. And so there's a link down the bottom of this slide for the SILK network. That's our network of student managed funds, and has been a great way to both increase the hands-on exposure for students to sustainable investing practices by actually investing in a sustainable strategy, and to also build some connections between those student managed funds and the endowments themselves. So just a great avenue. And the SILK network connects students at different schools with each other to sort of talk about what's working. So that's also the goal of the webinar today. So I don't want to take up more time on the background, but really want to get right to that connection, hear from all of your experiences, and can talk when we wrap up about additional ways that you can connect with the SILK network and with endowment stakeholders across our whole broad swath of institution types over the coming year. And we've got many ways to do that, including a conference coming up and including more opportunities like this. So I will switch back to seeing everyone's faces, and we'll hand it back to Julia to run us through the first round of questions and conversation and experiences, and then see that there's already some questions coming in on the chat, so we'll open up to those before the end of the hour too.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That was a great overview of really the diversity of ways that the Intentional Endowments Network engages with endowment stakeholders across the country. So to start off our conversation with the panelists, I want to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves in whatever way is most important to them. But starting with Alexis, could each of you go around and give us an overview of how you got involved with your respective previous positions that are related to the boards of trustees, what the conversation was like around divestment or socially responsible investing on your school's campus when you joined those positions, what your personal backgrounds were on some of these issues when you were entering those positions, and what being part of that decision-making process was like from the perspectives of young people in the room. So Alexis, why don't you start us off, and we'll go around to Michael and then Dustin.
Awesome. Yes, thank you so much, Julia, Hannah, for having me today. It's a true pleasure. And honestly, kudos to everyone for showing up on this Saturday afternoon. I mean, I think it speaks volumes to how passionate everybody is about this subject. And it is really remarkable. So very happy and honored to be here. So Julia gave a little bit of a background of me, my educational background, what I do on a day-to-day basis from a career perspective now. But if I look back at when I became involved with the CIR, which as Hannah had mentioned, is a committee for investor responsibility at the University of New Hampshire. I was a junior in college, studying accounting at the time, but I was involved in an investment group on campus that was housed within our business school. At the time, I had the opportunity to be president of that investment group. It was very exciting, a lot of incredibly hard work. Looking back, may have taken it a little too seriously, considering it was like an extracurricular activity, but nonetheless, it led me here, and I'm thankful for that. But because of that, I was asked to join the Committee on Investor Responsibility when it was formed in 2017. And one of the reasons that the CIR was formed was because of this ongoing need to support the work of the UNH Foundation's Investment and Finance Committee when they were going about enhancing their investment decision-making process. They had a goal of increasing the sustainable investment characteristics of their $200 million endowed portfolio. So that was really our primary long-term goal that we had. In the beginning stages, it was really not only getting to know each other. This was a board that was comprised of young alum, other alum from the school, myself now, having recently graduated, I guess 2 years ago, I still have the opportunity to be part of it. At the time, I was a student, of course, and we have students, active students now. There's also faculty and staff that are part of the board that are also working at UNH. So it was incredibly important for us to really just start to get to know each other, but also make sure that we were able to educate each other as we began to form this committee. I think that was one of the most important things that we did, was kind of take the time to create a baseline, make sure that, especially somebody like me, where I did have investment experience from the investment group, I may not have been well versed and committed in my studies specifically to this area. So we really took our time there, and then we started to kind of dive into some of the goals that we had, which I'm hoping to be able to speak about as we kind of continue on with this panel. So I don't want to take too much time, Julia. I know there were a couple of questions wrapped up in there. Did I miss any of the other intro questions, or can I pass it along?
I think that was a great first introduction. So, and we'll have time to dig into each one of those pieces that you mentioned later on. So why don't we pass it on to Michael?
Yeah, definitely. Good morning, or afternoon, I should say. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are located geographically. I'm Michael Davis, and it is truly, as Alexis said, truly a privilege and an honor to be speaking with you all on this Saturday afternoon. I do have one request, Julie. Can you repeat the question one more time? It was a lot of questions in that question. I want to make sure, again, I hit them up as well.
Absolutely. So first, would love for you to give an introduction, if there's anything that you'd like to add to what I mentioned before about you, and just talk a little bit about how you got involved as a student trustee at UNC Asheville, what the conversation was like around divestment or socially responsible investing on your campus at the time, and what your personal background on these issues was when you were coming in, what being part of that discussion process was like as a young person in the room. It's a lot of questions wrapped up in one, but it's okay if you don't answer all of them at once, basically.
Oh no, I'll try and hit them all. But yeah, for me personally, I remember going to UNCA, freshman year, straight out of high school, fully energized, excited about the environment, very heavily involved in high school with our environmental group that we had. And then, going into college, which was interestingly enough, I should say, 5 minutes from my high school, but going to the college and just seeing the relationship of what the university had started to build with the community, as well as other entities, other universities. Warren Wilson's about like 30 minutes away. It was very interesting to see that I was, one, going to a place that had the same ideas as it is around sustainability, and some of the same hopes and desires of what we could achieve. And so when I first came seeing that great relationship, I was like, I'll fit in great. This is good. And how I got to be really a part, I started in the Student Government Association my freshman year. I was the executive of diversity and inclusion And also on the board, we had someone who was over the environmental sustainability within the president's cabinet. And from there, one thing that we took to the administration was, hey, they were starting on a strategic plan. And so one of the pillars that we asked for was, hey, can sustainability be one of the main pillars of, you know, the strategic plan, what you decide to do for the future of the institution? And so they said yes, they hired someone. Here we go, everything's starting to move in motion. And how I guess I was always involved, but how I really got involved was one Valentine's Day. Some of the student activists from our sustainability group, as well as some individuals from the Student Government Association, went over to the chancellor's office on a Valentine's Day and had balloons and candy. But there was one thing that stuck out the most to the chancellor, to senior administration, that sent a message not only across our campus, but also to the community that surrounded our university, like I said, who had a great, strong ties with. It was an image of the chancellor and a couple other individuals from the Board of Trustees who were hugging a smokestack. And that just stuck out because, you know, most people, or I should say most individuals, they just have conversations, but this image really hit home to our senior administration. And they said, what are we really doing? Let's really take a look at this. So again, I'll get in more of that story and, you know, how I really played a role, but it started freshman year, and to see it happen freshman year, fast forward to my senior year, of signing legislation from the student government perspective, as well as from the Board of Trustees perspective. And then, you know, the university taking commitment to definitely do something and things begin to change and happen is absolutely remarkable. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Dustin. I hope I answered everything. I was trying to, you know, make sure I did, but I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Really great to hear both you and Alexis share a little bit about your experiences. First off, I hope everyone's taking care and staying safe. Like both of you folks have shared, it's such a pleasure to kind of go down memory lane and really revisit some of these questions around shared governance and youth leadership. So as Julia shared, I was the 2017 to 2019 undergraduate student elected trustee. Like Michael, I came from a student government route, so I was a leader on the student assembly and then transitioned onto the board. Thinking about where the conversation was, I think it's really important to contextualize how the conversations around divestment were really happening on Cornell's campus before I even knew what Cornell was. So I really credit the climate activists of the 2000s, early 2000s, particularly Kyoto Now, and a lot of those really foundational activists that made that issue present. So when I arrived on campus in 2015, we were actually in the midst of a surge of activism towards these issues. And in 2016, the board had actually voted against divestment. So it was a 2016 decision that was really the culmination of a lot of energy. And I entered the role in a moment where I thought this is really an opportunity for us to have creative destruction around what this next step should look like. So what we heard back from the board was a variety of inputs and pathways forward around how to leverage shared governance, how to make sure that we're centering youth voices. And it actually turned into 2 years of thinking about how we can build relationships and make these issues present. I think in so many ways, activism can repeat itself. And I think what I found so fascinating, particularly stepping into this role, was the way in which we understood the history of climate activism at Cornell and built upon it and made it still present, even though we had gotten a less than positive decision. A little bit about my personal background. I came into the role really curious about higher education and how we can make sure that young voices are heard. So, you know, I'm just so inspired by the work of the boarding school. But what I'm really curious about, and I think I'm going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this, is it's sometimes a really tricky needle to thread around elevating student voices and pushing forward what can be really contentious issues, and thinking about the role of the student trustee as a way to bridge those conversations and really provide some education around students. Learning how to make change at an institution became a really central part of how I saw my role on campus.
Fantastic. And I think that Dustin is absolutely right. We're taking a little trip down memory lane, so excited to dive into more of that with you all. So now I'll go into more specific questions with each of the panelists, and like Hannah mentioned before, we'll get to some questions in the chat afterwards. But starting with Dustin, you actually mentioned Cornell's shared governance model, which a lot of people might be familiar with and others not so much. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about what that is, what that meant to you in your specific role as an undergraduate student elected trustee, and how you think that model, especially the way in which the Board of Trustees, when they first denied the decision in 2016, might have shaped Cornell's Board of Trustees discussion later on sustainable investments.
That's a great question, Julia. And I want to point out that we do have Cornellians on this call and student assembly leaders. So if I put my foot in my mouth, feel free to correct me in the chat. So Cornell's shared governance model came out of student activism in the late 1960s, around 1969, an opportunity for us to really re-envision decision-making at the institution. So the history of shared governance resulted in a variety of bodies. Today, they're known as the University Assembly, the Student Assembly, the Faculty Senate. And these groups and organizations were really aimed at having more open, representative, and democratic ways of serving as mechanisms for participation in university decision-making. What I think is important about this, and while the history of Cornell's shared governance structure is unique, I think understanding the practices and policies of how institutions are set up and the history of governance structures is incredibly important for students to make change. So when I think about what we call shared governance at the university, the most applicable lesson that I would say is applicable across all college campuses is the decisions that came out of the 2016 board vote. The chair of our Board of Trustees had indicated that in order to have this recommendation received by the board again, it would need to pass through all the assembly bodies of shared governance. And I think in that moment, we realized that the mechanism of shared governance is unique, but understanding the pathways to make change is not. So what I found so interesting about the Board of Trustees decisions and the discussions around sustainable investment is that it started to foster more discussions around ways in which we could push this forward in shared governance systems. And I think that's certainly shown in the most recent activism in 2019, 2020, where we saw that shared governance bodies, and I credit this to the student leaders and the community leaders on campus, began to take a very constructive look at what trustees cared about, what the university's priorities were, and how you could really tailor arguments around those goals. The investment committee documents that were put together by staff, faculty, and students, the white paper on divestment that was drafted by the Campus Infrastructure Committee, just really demonstrates how different the conversation was when we built relationships and we started to understand this is how we can make sure that student voices are heard and not rejected. And this is how we can have some interest convergence around the conversation of divestment and the university interests.
Great. And I would love to dig into that more, especially on the part about sort of the strategies that you might have used to engage some of those additional perspectives in the Board of Trustees. But just so that we keep up with time and allow time to engage audience questions, I'll move on to asking Michael a little bit more about his experience on the UNC Asheville Board of Trustees, where actually, so the student body president serves not just as the leader of the undergraduate student government, but also serves on the Board of Trustees, the board of the foundation, and the board of the Association of Student Governments. So a lot of goals all in one. But I am curious to know a little bit about how serving in all of those different positions at once might have informed the way that you approach UNC Asheville's Board of Trustees discussion on sustainable investments, and how that might have shaped the trajectory of student activism over the course of multiple student governments before you.
Yeah, definitely. I truly believe that it's, again, I pay homage to those who definitely started the conversation. And I can honestly, truly say that I am very fortunate to, one, stay abreast to the situations and definitely the conversation, and grateful to my predecessors who allowed me to sit in the room while they were having the conversations. So, and that's, most people take that for granted, but some of the closed meetings that were most students aren't allowed into, but they invited the student government, which diversity and inclusion, but I definitely spoke my mind and said, I want to be in SGA until I graduate. And I definitely was. So I definitely thank them. And, listening to, watching the progression and watching the involvement of thinking as it pertains to our Board of Trustees, and also those who were in student government who took on the leadership role before I became president and sat on the boards. It was very interesting because one very interesting thing was that the foundation gave some of the seed money, startup money, for students to be able to start the divestment process and to start the conversation. And that's interesting because one, a student had to go, a student who's sitting on that board, most people on here, if you're the only student sitting on the board, they typically look at you when there are student issues and they expect you to have an answer because they themselves are not there. So if you say yes, they'll of course do their due diligence and research, but for the most part, they're taking you for your word. So one, it was interesting because a student in my position, or well, my current position, past position, I should say, definitely did their homework, did their due diligence, and said, this is something we need to get a hold of. This is something we should take a change on. This is something that will set us apart from all of the other institutions who are just in the beginning stages, but you help us achieve this goal, and trust me, it'll be absolutely amazing. So from a foundation perspective of giving the seed money to the Board of Trustees, sitting on that board, and really wearing two hats, knowing both sides and hearing both of the cons as to why they don't want to, but you being the sounding voice of, hey, this is why, and really bringing people. One thing that I definitely did is I brought students who were there, students who had graduated before, who were there helping set up everything. I brought them back, and it was, hey, I need you to, you did a great job. You left, everything in great hands, but there's something that you have, there's a portion of the story that you have, or the missing piece of the puzzle, that they're still not grasping. Can you come back and speak to them? Because what we've done was we've tried to carry on the initiative, but we still need that extra push or that extra information or whatever it is, that extra convincing to convince the Board of Trustees to definitely help us. And which, relates into going to the other board of having conversations with my other constituents, other student body presidents across the system, the UNC system, of, hey, I'm having this situation. This is what we're trying to do as it pertains to our divestment fund. How did you have the conversations with your Board of Trustees? How did you convince them? What were the things that you did? Can you help me so that way I can craft it in a way to where it can really resonate with them and hit home with them? And so I say all that to say all three boards play a role, and they really do feed into each other, especially being a student, because you are the only voice. I wouldn't say the only voice, but yeah, you are the only voice that is on that board that sees the day in and day out of what actually happens on your campus and what actually happens behind the scenes and what students are actually saying as it pertains to climate change and what the institution should do, and not just say they're going to do. So I don't know if that answered your question. I think that was a long way about it, but I think I answered it.
No, it very much does. And especially, I mean, it's impressive, like you said, the due diligence that your predecessors contributed to something like this over a long period of time. So I'll also pass it on to Alexis, just noting that we have around 15 minutes left in the allotted time for the webinar. But so Alexis, actually, the University of New Hampshire system has actually 2 voting student trustees on its 29-member Board of Trustees. And while it hasn't divested from fossil fuels, it was recently ranked 9th for sustainability efforts on the Sierra Club's top 20 coolest schools of 2020. So thanks to, in large part, a lot of the University System of New Hampshire's set of sustainability projects on campus and growth from 0 to 70 million in ESG, which is again, the environmental, social, and governance-based investments since 2015. Could you walk us through a little bit about how some of the discussions that you might have had on the Committee on Investor Responsibility actually made it into the boardroom and what it was like to participate in them, again, from the student and young person perspective?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Julia. And we're very proud of the ranking. I think it's very cool, pun intended. But I think that from, you know, where I sit on the CIR, it's definitely a little bit different than maybe the experiences that Dustin and Michael had, in the sense that, again, this committee was formed specifically to help the Investment and Finance Committee. So when we had the opportunity to make it into that boardroom, they were very welcoming, and certainly very appreciative of the work that we had put together. So I'm very grateful that I was invited in and that we had that seat at the table, because you know, I applaud all of the work that any students do to have their voices heard. But yes, I definitely came from a situation where they were asking me to voice how I felt as part of the CIR. So with that being said, one of the initial things that really, you know, when I think back and take the trip down memory lane, that really stands out to me was actually one of the specific meetings, the first meetings that we had as a committee, where we had the opportunity to walk into the Omni Parker House, which is a hotel in downtown Boston, and sit down with the Investment and Finance Committee. And we had several recommendations that we wanted the committee to implement and sign off on. And 3 of the 4 recommendations that we had were, they welcomed it with open arms. There was also a lot of really rich conversation about it, and it really just got the ball rolling so that we could consistently have these iterative conversations and work to, again, be a resource to the Investment and Finance Committee. So one of the first things that I was able to do was I sat down, again, this was my junior year, very intimidating group of folks, as I'm sure a lot of these conversations are. And I was able to walk through the sort of 3 primary goals that we had. The first one being just to adopt a policy of annual disclosure. So again, when we think about it, a significant rationale for continued and growing focus on ESG investing is a body of research that really demonstrates that organizations with good governance have stronger financial performance over the long run. And part of good governance, of course, are components of transparency and accountability. So it was really important to us that we had an ability to disclose within the Investment and Finance Committee annual report where we were invested, what we were invested in. They were very receptive to that. The second one was that we wanted to actually join the IEN, which is where all of this started, and the UN Principles of Responsible Investing, so UNPRI. And again, they were receptive, open to that, very grateful that we had started that discussion. And then we also had a goal of moving some of the endowed funds in the main pool of the endowment that, when they were given, had a mission that aligned with to be prime candidates for our ESG sleeve. So again, looking back at the mission of the funds that were given, we were able to have sign off to again continue that discussion and start that process. That was amazing as a student, to be honest, to walk into a room, to be welcomed in the room, to be leaned on for the research that we had done as a committee on investor responsibility. I truly believe that that was one of the cornerstones and one of the great things that I was able to do on campus. And it was amazing to sit down in a room where people were warm and welcoming and had incredible questions that hopefully we would be able to answer and walk through that conversation. With that being said, you know, as I have continued on the CIR, there's been several iterations of these conversations. I specifically, as a young alum, haven't had a situation that's been very similar to that. As again, I had mentioned, that was really one of the first things that we did as a CIR, but we have the opportunity to sit down at the table often. And I'm very grateful for that. The conversation is ongoing and it's always changing. As Hannah said, with the IEN's roadmap, I mean, I remember speaking a few years ago, Hannah, at another webinar that you had put together, and it's so true that, you know, you start down the roadmap, you circle back. You start down again, you circle back. So again, iterative and that openness is very important. So I'll pause there, Julia, because I know we're a little bit short on time, but that was something that was very important to me, and certainly encourage any student that is interested in having these important conversations. Definitely just do it, go for it. As Dustin had mentioned, do so with purpose and do so in a way that is effective, as sometimes these conversations can be difficult to have. But yes, I am a big proponent for speaking up and using your voice.
Great. And it seems like you really got to have, a big role in not just sort of the Committee on Investor Responsibility, but really getting your hands dirty in the endowment management side of things as well. So it's a great perspective to have. Hannah, with that said, do you want to lead us through some questions that might have been coming through in the chat or in the registration for the event?
Yeah, absolutely. And a big thank you for sharing all those journeys. And it is really, I think, really helpful to hear that these have been long processes, but that, even though there are different students cycling through these institutions, and sometimes that can feel like a barrier to progress, that by building over time, it's led to the success and really embedding that, that iteration and that building into the governance structures is just really, really encouraging to hear. So a big thank you. And yes, thank you to everyone for sending in questions in advance. And I know many of them were covered in these presentations intentionally. And feel free to add some more in the chat now, or use the hand raise function if you'd like to ask a question on the line. And we did get a number of questions about, what are the most effective arguments and data points for the divestment conversation in particular. And I might add some links in the chat and that we can follow up with afterwards on the specifics of that. But would love to kind of continue the theme. There were a couple of questions around just how do you keep making this change when you hit setbacks, or when you face some of those barriers, or you have a gap, you're not sure how to move forward. Because I think having everybody on the line together, it's a great opportunity to hear some of that. I think something that's on many of our minds these days, like when things aren't moving as fast as you'd like, how do you kind of keep going with that? So I don't know if there's somebody that wants to kick off with that one, and then we should have a few minutes for the questions that are coming in on the chat too. I saw some nodding, but not to. Dustin, do you want to jump in?
I'm sitting with that big question. And I think for me, it really has to do with centering the issues, no matter when setbacks are put into play. I think for my term, I was really interested in how we build understanding of the university and students, right? In a weird way, student leaders are also sociologists. We're looking at the institution, we're seeing what levers we can pull. And I think the best way in which we can make change at institutions is to understand how they operate. So I talk about stories of working with students and bringing students in collaboration or in dinners with trustees, and placing the climate activists next to the chair of the investment committee, right? Soft power, ways in which you can make that conversation present. And I think in so many ways, and this is an allusion to one of the questions in the chat, that spectrum of working with trustees and then working against trustees, in so many ways, I think both need to be present, ways in which we can challenge trustees, but also can be partners in change. And I think the role of the student trustee, particularly in these private institutions, is that dual cap role. Sometimes you're an activist, sometimes you're a partner. And I think managing those relationships is incredibly important. So I think the first thing that I did when I joined the board was to do a power map. I had one-on-one conversations with all of the senior administrators on campus and had a 30-minute conversation to ask, what decisions are you in charge of and how do you make change? And I think by understanding who to contact, or in a better way, how to share that information with other students on campus, they're not going on a wild goose hunt. They're going straight to the person who will be able to elevate that decision. And that's how decisions get made. And that's how we can push these conversations forward. But Alexis and Michael, I want to throw it to you folks. That's a really generative question.
Yeah, I'll definitely take it. I wouldn't take a stab at it. I'll definitely say establishing the relationships with the trustee as well as senior leadership at the institution is definitely something that I still use to this day. And a great example of that is preparing for this phone call. I called up a couple of the board of trustee members that I sat with. I called up with the CFO of the institution, who also is over the foundation's monies as well. And I called the chancellor and I said, hey, I just want to run some things by you so I can be correct when I do have the panel conversation. But it's really when you hit that, for me, it was when I hit that roadblock, it was, okay, let me not lean to my own strength, but let me lean to the strength of other students who is also in this fight with me. And so if it was a presentation, let me bring you along to the conversation. If it was a dinner at the chancellor's residence, let me bring some students, let me bring some of our key partners that are in the community that we are working with, some of the banking, some of the firms. Let me just bring them all together. And in this setting at the chancellor's residence, where it was pretty much any and everybody of the who's who, if you will. I have them all in one room, and I have people who are saying the same thing that I am saying, you know, in this room. So maybe if the message isn't coming clear of how I am fully articulating it, maybe the way that someone else may say it can definitely come across in a whole new different line. It's like, oh, I didn't know that, you know. And me, it's like, I've been saying that, but whoever has to say it for it to really hit home, I am all ears and all game. So definitely when it's becoming hard, when you feel that roadblock, definitely pull on other people who are also in the fight with you, and definitely, you know, build those relationships with the senior administration, board of trustee members, and definitely pull in those partners as well from the community to definitely help you drive home what you're trying to do.
Yeah, Michael, I think that is, I feel like you're kind of in my head right now, because that was literally exactly what I was thinking. And specifically as it relates to that first sort of initial conversation that I had spoken about, you know, we did have a recommendation that there was a lot of robust conversation around, but ultimately it was something that we knew we needed to come back to. It wasn't the initial like, yes, 100%. In terms of approval. So it was really taking a step back, understanding the key stakeholders, understanding maybe the areas in which they, or the places in which they're coming from, so that we can then tap into any resources that we need to understand. I don't use the word bias, but what I mean by that is that they are very knowledgeable in a specific area. We need to understand the ways in which the request that we're making, and we need to understand the way that request relates and or differs from the area in which they come from, that bias that they have, in order to be able to then circle back, have a more effective conversation, and understand the key points and areas of interest that they have, so that we could ultimately move forward with continuing to make that recommendation. So completely agree with you. Utilize your resources, tap into anything that you can, and also give others the opportunity to speak and sit down at that table and bring their perspectives as well.
Yes, I love all the nodding along, and I think we're all seconding a lot of these ideas. So we only have a couple of minutes left. There's a great question though around how we create more awareness about sustainability, sustainable investing, and kind of the role that the governance plays. I would even add to that as well. But, you know, to bring more people into the conversation, sometimes there is a like learning curve there. And so I don't know, Julia, if you have kind of a big picture from what you're seeing in the boarding schools work, or others can chime in, and might leave that as the last question, and then we'll wrap up. But we are all here for more questions, so if yours hasn't been answered yet, we can follow up later. But with that last question to the floor, are there any quick thoughts on how to, you know, bring more people in and along that learning curve?
So on the broader question of raising awareness generally, I would say that a great opportunity for doing these sorts of things is to engage cross university on a lot of topics, especially given that over the course of, you know, building the boarding school, I've come to understand that the governance structures of universities are not standardized at all. Like, universities do their own thing in all different ways, from the number of people who sit on their boards to the way that decisions get made, the trajectory that they take through different committees, from the students to the very highest levels of their governing bodies. And so I think that the best way really to raise awareness is to learn as much as possible about what strategies other universities are using and what pathways students take at other universities to make these decisions come to the very top, because you never know, what kind of structure or committee or policy or position another university might have that you can translate to the unique sort of environment that you as a student or as a young person might be in at your own university. But that would be sort of my main takeaway, is that there seems to be no playbook as to how decisions get made. So you might as well borrow strategies that have been effective at other universities. But I don't know if that resonates with other panelists. Yeah, I would love to hear from you all as to how to raise awareness on these different issues.
One thing that I just wanted to add is that I was thinking during the introduction from Hannah when she was talking about the Silk Network. I think that is a phenomenal opportunity to connect students across different universities. And truthfully, Julia, everything that you said, I mean, having the opportunity to learn from others, discuss ways in which what you're doing at your university might differ from other universities, things that worked, things that didn't, just keep engaging in those conversations. And I think that the Silk Network would be a wonderful way to do that. So.
Awesome. You gave the plug that I was going to give in the last minute. So I added the link to the Silk Network in the chat, along with several others that we will share out by email. And I know we're at time and want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I just want to say another huge thank you to all of our panelists, to everyone joining. Again, there are many ways to engage with the Intentional Endowments Network in ways that we hope to support all of you. And so would love to keep in touch. All of our contact information is on our website, and would love to hear from any of you and follow up. Would love for you to get engaged with the Silk Network or with our upcoming event series, the Climate Action Pursuit. But I will leave the last word to Julia and our panelists to sign off, and ways that you can stay in touch with them as well. But my last word will just be a big thank you to you.
Similarly, yeah, thank you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon or morning during a tumultuous week. But I'm going to send a message in the chat as to how you can reach us at the boarding school. Again, we're really dedicated to empowering young people to take part in some of that institutional governance that is deciding our futures right now. So if you're a young trustee who's just looking for an additional support network, someone who is thinking about potentially joining a board of trustees as a young person, if you are a university looking to diversify their governance, or anyone who is interested in supporting the boarding school's general mission, you can email me at julia@theboardingschool.org or visit theboardingschool.org, our website. With that said, though, I do want to hand it off to the panelists to see if they have any last words and encouragement for our audience.
I guess I'll be first. Thank you all so much again for joining and definitely listening to what we have to say. I don't take it lightly. You did not have to come. You did not have to listen. You do not have to take heed to what we said. But the fact that you are, I am truly grateful, and know that you have us as allies. And if you need anything, I'll definitely throw my email inside of the chat, as well as you can find me on LinkedIn. And from there, if you need to follow me on any other social media, by all means you can. But know that the work that you're doing is definitely important. It is definitely needed. And we are so happy. I am so happy that in this dispensation of time, you are here to definitely lead the change. So thank you.
Michael, just to plus one that I'm feeling the power of young people, and I'm feeling the power of drawing back into history, looking at this information that we have. I think it's just so important to document the steps that we have taken, be really visible with our storytelling, and make sure that future generations of student leaders are still able to push that work forward. Alexis, close us out.
Yeah, wow, tough act to follow, both of you. Thank you all for showing up today. That is the sometimes hardest part. That is the most important part. That is the start. Keep showing up. I think it's incredible. Keep working hard. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But best wishes to everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you all for being with us today. Take care.
Have a great rest of your weekends, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right.